Water is such an important sector to worry about under climate change, especially already there are many stressed places in terms of access, physical, economical, quantity, quality, and so on. So I'm going to take as many reports as I feel are worthy of including here because they make slightly different points from the other reports, and some points we will repeat, but that's okay. Water, food, energy, health, these are very critical and they're all related to each other. So we'll look at this report from the Economic Commission for Europe, Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes. So the title is Guidance on Water and Adaptation to Climate Change. So we'll look at some messages which are somewhat re-emphasizing what we already heard, but worth going through again. The world needs to adapt to climate change in water management without delay. That's fairly obvious. Hydrometeorological records and climate projections provide abundant evidence that water resources are vulnerable and can be strongly affected by climate change, with wide-ranging consequences for human societies and ecosystems. So future projections in climate change obviously have uncertainties. First decade or two, internal variability, then model uncertainties, then scenario uncertainties. But in terms of just looking at the risk and taking action, it's a no-brainer to adapt for water issues, so we'll keep that in mind. Looking at more key messages, uncertainty should never be a reason for inaction. That's what I just said. But it's a question of how to prioritize. It's a zero-sum game. If you put money here, then you'll have less money or no money for something else. So action and research on adaptation should be pursued simultaneously. Okay. Adaptation needs to be flexible, which we have repeated many times. As you can see, I'm skipping these texts because they are details that you can read up from the report that's available online. I'll be brief and just summarize the main points with some details coming up in other parts of this report. The process of developing and implementing adaptation measures should build on learning by doing. We have seen this in various contexts already in this series of podcasts on adaptation for health and food and water and so on. Learning by doing comes at shorter time scales with early warnings, and it's not possible for longer decision horizons like decadal time scales. But nonetheless, adaptation needs to be flexible at all time scales. So only way in this strategy, only way this sentence is just written completely wrong. Only in this way can strategy changes be made in good time. What is this? This is steps taken may not achieve the desired results, or they may have unexpected side effects, while the effects of climate change may also run counter to expectations. This highlights the need for local risk information in a reliable way, which we have emphasized elsewhere, whether it's Libyan dam collapse or landslides over some parts of the Himalayan foothills in India, or wildfires in Greece, and so on and so forth. So making adaptation flexible and learning by doing along the way requires this iteration between information, planning, implementation, action, and then iteration with the planning again. Water is central to many different sectors that directly depend on water being available and of high quality. Therefore, water management can limit or enhance adaptation of water-related sectors. Seems obvious, but we need to re-emphasize these again and again. Re-emphasize is already again. Okay. Implementing integrated water resource management supports adaptation. So this is the idea of nexus approach, not just worrying about water, but also water for food, water for health, water for industries and energy and so on. Core principles of integrated water resource management include planning at the river basin level, strong intersectoral cooperation, which is food, water, energy, health, transportation, public participation, and making the best use of water resources. So stakeholder engagement is always critical, which we have discussed already many times. Any adaptation policy needs to consider climate change as one of the many pressures on water resources. Others include population growth, migration, globalization, changing consumption patterns, and agricultural and industrial development. Countries like Pakistan and India, for example, are exporting massive amounts of grains because that's how they make some of their GDP growth. But in a sense, they are using their groundwater resources often to send grains elsewhere. So water and agriculture there become vulnerabilities for the countries themselves doing this, even though there is economic development involved in doing that. So how to plan for those in terms of what would happen to groundwater recharge with climate change, so that you have a diversified portfolio of GDP growth and not just using groundwater to grow grains and export them. Happens with wheat and cotton and sugarcane, sugar, and various fruits and vegetables as well, flowers, etc. Effective adaptation to climate change requires a cross-sectoral approach, including at the transboundary level, in order to prevent possible conflicts between different sectors and to consider trade-offs and synergies between adaptation and mitigation measures. Right? Barriers to adaptation in the legal, institutional, and policy spheres must be removed. We've discussed this already as well. Legislation should be developed flexibly to be able to cope with different possible climate impacts. This information is always required at local level. Within a country, you need sub-national level information on climate risks to water resources and the barriers to adaptation in legal, institutional, and policy spheres. There is learning by doing in these spheres as well, right? Implementing national legislation and international commitments supports adaptation. Okay, so there are frameworks like the EU Water Framework Directive, for instance, which builds on the principles of integrated water source management and the ways countries should cooperate in water management. Okay. Transboundary cooperation is both necessary and beneficial in adapting to climate change. Many rivers run across boundaries, and upstream and downstream water use, riparian rights, developed during the time when water was abundant. Migration and global connectivities were not as pervasive as they are now. Migration was not as pervasive, trade, and so on and so forth. So these need to be dealt with again in the transboundary issues. It's necessary throughout the entire process of developing and implementing an adaptation strategy. When planning adaptation across boundaries, riparian countries should focus on preventing transboundary impacts, sharing benefits and risks in an equitable and reasonable manner, and cooperating on the basis of equality and reciprocity. Very nice words, but in practice, even two states in a country like India, let's say Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, sharing the Kaveri waters, have all kinds of struggles. 2023 monsoon being a good example. Karnataka has severe droughts. Tamil Nadu doesn't receive much rain in the summer, receives much more during northeast monsoon, and it had a bit of surplus rain, and yet it wants its share of the Kaveri water. Karnataka refuses to release it. The Supreme Court comes in and says you must release it. But what kind of monitoring, evaluation, and so on are going on in making these legal mandates? Okay, those are critical for transboundary, not just international boundaries, but any riparian boundaries. Okay, knowledge and experience need to be exchanged to enhance the capacity of countries to adapt. So this comes to Global South and their inability to develop their own institutional frameworks, knowledge base, and technology transfers, etc., to adapt. Ensuring that data and information are readily available is crucial for making climate projections and identifying vulnerable groups and regions. So sharing information, including that from early warning systems, between countries and sectors is essential for effective and efficient climate change adaptation. Okay, so India, for example, has invested massively in improving weather and climate forecasts, and has a program to share and train people in the neighborhood to use the forecasts as well. And the vulnerabilities of the countries in the Indian subcontinent and the Indian Ocean rim countries are closely tied to each other, with external players playing geopolitical games in the ocean, everybody vying for deep sea minerals, fisheries, and so on and so forth. So all these become complicated when you want to share and be equitable and just, and so on and so forth. Effective adaptation strategies are a mix of structural and non-structural regulatory and economic instruments and measures, education and awareness raising to tackle the short, medium, and long-term impacts of climate change. Okay, adaptation is not possible without these. Adaptation measures should strive to be cost-effective, environmentally sustainable, culturally compatible, and socially acceptable. Prioritization of measures should be based on the results of vulnerability assessments, costs and benefit assessments, as well as on the development objectives, stakeholder considerations, and the resources available. Okay. Water supply and sanitation, especially during extreme weather events, require special attention in adaptation policy, as they are essential for good health. So here is the sectoral connection from water to health, which is fairly direct, right? Water and food, waterborne and foodborne diseases, and then the connections to energy, bioenergy especially, and so on, have to be considered together. Adaptation may be costly, but it's much more cost effective to start it now, because costs will be much higher once the effects of climate change are irreversible. Paying for adaptation should be done by a mix of public and private funding. We've talked about how crisis management without planning for resilience building and adaptation for resilience building, you will just be paying more and more for disaster management rather than reducing the impacts of disaster by long-term investment in adaptation to build resilience. Stakeholder participation is crucial for all steps of the development and implementation of adaptation strategies and measures. Re-emphasizing it, education, capacity building, and communication are imperative for cost-effective adaptation in water. Climate change and the need for adaptation is also an opportunity for innovation and new technologies. So solutions are often based on problems, and climate change, especially in the water sector, keeps offering many problems to be solved just in terms of quantity, quality, access, and renewable, sustainable use, additionality of sources, and so on and so forth. Risks for water and other sectors through climate change. This is quite general. Maybe I'll read it before going to the next podcast. So we have heavy precipitation, higher vulnerability of precipitation, including increased droughts and increased temperatures. So water resources affect. So examples of major projected impacts by sector, mainly through water. We have looked at this under the IPCC report summary that I have included in climate change course, climate science course, and elsewhere before as well. But just to quickly run through, you have projected impacts on water resources, agriculture and ecosystems, health, industry, and society. Obviously, there are things like flooding, adverse effects on quality of surface and groundwater due to sewer overflows, damage to crops and soil erosion, increased risks of death, physical injuries, and infectious respiratory and skin diseases, psychological disorders as well, disruption of settlements, commerce, transport, and societies due due to flooding. Resilient infrastructure is something we talked a lot about. And under higher vulnerability of precipitation, including droughts, changes in runoff, more widespread water stress, land degradation, lower yields, crop damage and failure, increased risk of food and water shortages for settlements and industry and societies, and increased temperatures will lead to increased water temperatures, increased evaporation, earlier snow melting, permafrost melting, and of course pathogen abundance and health risks here, changes in vector-borne diseases, increases in fatality due to heat waves, and decreased personal productivity. For agriculture and ecosystems, we will have less water available for agriculture, more irrigation needed to deal with warmer temperatures, vapor pressure deficits, evapotranspiration changes, and so on. Changes in crop productivity, and for industries and societies, we will have risk for infrastructure fixed in permafrost, degradation of freshwater quality, and so on. This is just expected climate change impacts on health. These are around for a long time, started with Pats on climate and health, I think. So climate change goes through regional weather changes. We'll have modulating influences, including vaccines, human actions, and so on. But you have various microbial contamination pathways, transmission dynamics, agroecosystems and hydrology, and socioeconomics and demographics acting together with regional weather changes like heat waves, extreme weather, and so on to produce health effects. This played out very well during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. So temperature related illnesses and death, extreme weather related health effects, air pollution related health effects, water and foodborne, vector-borne, rodent-borne, food and water shortages, mental, nutritional, infectious, and other health effects. With gaps and barriers here, research needs, health-specific adaptation measures that we have discussed, and evaluation of adaptation options as well. So this is a nice iterative process on how to deal with climate change in the context of water, health, and adaptation. Okay, so I'll definitely close this here and come back and look at key steps to guidance. Okay. I hope we are clear as to where we are. This is the guidance for adaptation in the water sector and climate change from the European Commission. Okay.